Thanks very much. Thanks, Martin. Yeah, as Martin mentioned, I'm from ODI in London, but until very recently, I was actually a research fellow here at IDD, based with GSDRC. That's where I did most of the work with my co-author Heather on the report that I'm here to talk to you about today. So it's a real pleasure to be back here to present some of the findings. Thanks very much, Martin, for having me. Thank you to all of you for coming along and listening. Thanks to my co-author Heather, and thanks to Brian, Lucas, and Louise Curry as well for their support in the production of the report. The aim of the report is to provide a critical overview of the literature on thinking and working politically, to try to identify whether there are particular strengths or weaknesses in the way that these approaches have been documented and analysed, and to set out some general guidance on where researchers should focus next. There are, I should say, other very good reviews out there on thinking and working politically and on similar kinds of approaches, but we wanted to do something that was a bit more comprehensive and systematic. One of the ways in which we tried to do that was by compiling a database of all of the case studies that we could find out there on programs that are, broadly speaking, adopting a thinking and working politically approach. And we use that database as the sort of empirical substance for the report, and we used it to trace certain patterns in the literature, which I'll talk about as I move through the talk. I'm sure it won't come as news to anyone here to learn that politics has become a really major preoccupation for a number of donors over the last 15 years or so. This increased focus on politics and power in development is partly, I think, the culmination of a longer standing frustration amongst a lot of development practitioners that many development interventions haven't really been achieving their intended impact, despite sustained efforts to improve their technical quality. There is now, I think, a pretty robust consensus that the persistence of poor policies and dysfunctional institutions often has less to do with a lack of finance or technical know-how, and more to do with the actions of powerful stakeholders in recipient countries who benefit from existing arrangements in some sense and so resist change. The argument follows that the difference between development projects that successfully support change and those that fall short is an understanding of and a proactive engagement with local political actors and dynamics. Now, these ideas are not necessarily new. The importance of paying attention to political context, the need to adapt in response to changes on the ground, these are ideas that have been around in development since at least the 1960s. But I think what is new is the level of interest that we're currently seeing in the donor world in engaging with politics and power. If you speak to officials in DFID or the Australian Department for Foreign Affairs and Trade or other agencies, they'll tell you that more and more the terms of reference and the business cases for new program designs call for designs that enable actors to think and work politically or flex and adapt. There's been a real increase in applied political economy analysis and adaptive management tools in USAID. The 2017 World Development Report was very heavily focused on politics and power. And this in particular, I think, was something of a watershed moment for people who follow these debates because of the bank's apolitical mandate. And over the last few years, more and more, you see the subject of politics and power taking center stage at major international events and conferences. Now, that's not to say that this interest in thinking and working politically has necessarily always been supported by donors or translated into changes at the operational level. And I'll say a little bit more about some of the reasons for that later on in my talk. But I think at the very least, you can say that the donor community has become much more open, much more engaged in the language of politics, and much more open about the need to understand and engage with political interests and incentives to make progress on development challenges. In parallel with this increased interest in the donor world, there are a couple of different movements within the research and the policy engagement community that are looking to reflect upon and capture these changes to the way development assistance is being framed and discussed. Since 2013, an informal community of practice has been meeting under the banner Thinking, Working Politically, and a similar group has been meeting since around 2014 under the slogan Doing Development Differently, and they both endorse very similar ideas. In the last year or so, DFID has provided a small amount of funding to the Thinking, Working Politically group to support a small secretariat that's been based here at Birmingham, comprised of myself, Heather, Brian, and Louise. And we've used that funding for a couple of things. We've supported the formation of a couple of informal working groups who are looking at the application of these ideas in specific sectors. We've helped organise a few conferences and meetings, and we've also kickstarted a few new streams of research, one of which is the synthesis paper that I'm here to talk to you about today. Can we move on to the slide, please? Thank you. Thinking, Working Politically is essentially a way of framing development assistance in response to what I take to be two fairly uncontroversial observations about the nature of developmental change. The first is that change is inherently political in that it almost always involves the renegotiation of power and resources. Given that any reform process usually creates winners and losers, it follows that in recipient countries, there will almost always be actors who are supportive of change and those who are opposed to it. And the argument follows that development projects that are able to understand the constellation of interests and actors at play and are able to align themselves with those who are supportive of change are much more likely to succeed. The second point is that change is complex, right? It's often unpredictable. Developmental change involves a whole host of moving and interlocking parts, many of which are completely hidden at the design stage of programs. Development processes involve changes in behavior, interactions amongst any number of different actors. And for that reason, the problems that development programs are looking to address are often not susceptible to ready-made solutions. Thinking, Working Politically is a way for donors to adjust the way they work in response to these observations. It implies that external actors have to pay very close attention not only to the politics of other countries when they design and implement their programs, but also consider the impact that they themselves have on the politics of those countries. So it's about donors recognizing that they themselves are political actors rather than just providers of funding or technical assistance. So what does TWP look like in practice, and what does it help to achieve? There is no single agreed definition or framework or formal set of tools for thinking, working politically. Instead, when you look at the literature, what you see are a set of recurring factors that are said to help account for the success of more politically informed approaches in comparison to a more conventional technical approach. So what are some of these success factors? Fairly self-evidently, thinking, working politically implies that external actors need to be armed with the very best knowledge that they can generate or access about local political dynamics. Being politically smart means having a really in-depth understanding of the country and the sector context, the embedded structures, the history, the institutions, the relationships, and so on. Ideally, the research and the analysis on which this political understanding is based is something that's renewed throughout the program cycle rather than being something that just happens at the outset. Being politically smart is also about being politically astute. So it's about knowing how to use that political knowledge to make more effective decisions about how to act or how to not act in the context of pursuing particular objectives. Often, I think what you see is that being politically smart is less about the formal application of a model of analysis and more about a more kind of spontaneous adjustment of ways of working on the part of experienced practitioners who are embedded in the local structures and have the right kinds of networks and relationships. Thinking working politically also places a very strong emphasis on identifying issues that are important to local actors and enabling them to play a leading role in finding solutions or steering the program approach, rather than introducing sort of international best practice or addressing predetermined issues that are determined by external actors. Partly, I think this is about donor humility, so recognizing that the external actors rarely have all of the answers. The flip side of that is that local actors often have a better understanding of the most salient problems and often a better understanding of how to develop solutions that have traction and are likely to be sustainable in the long run. This importance of local leadership feeds into an emphasis in thinking and working politically on donors brokering relationships, so facilitating meetings, performing a kind of convening function, bringing together local stakeholders, enlisting partners, and helping them to find solutions to the problems as they see them. Thinking working politically also often implies taking an iterative approach to problem solving. So instead of following a blueprint plan, implementing teams often search for the right kind of approach through a cycle of testing, learning, and adapting the program approach in response to the information that arises. What that means in practice is that the design and the implementation of these kinds of programs often happen simultaneously or in a very tight sequence. One of the ways of going about that kind of iterative approach is placing a series of small bets in various different areas and then responding to the ones that seem to be paying off and scaling back or stopping your approach in the areas that are not bearing fruit. Being agile enough to do that kind of iterative work calls for a certain degree of flexibility on the part of donors. As I mentioned, development problems very often involve a whole series of moving parts. And what that means is that the desirable outcomes in any given situation are difficult to achieve and difficult to predict. Thinking and working politically calls for a more flexible program design in response that avoids prescribing sort of set targets in a rigid kind of way or locking teams into working with particular institutions or organizations. Flexible funding, so the ability to adjust expenditure to move pots of money around as the situation calls for it, is often one of the ways in which teams go about operating in these more flexible ways. In quite a significant number of the case studies that we looked at, there is a longer than usual time commitment being made on the part of donors, and by that we mean longer than 6 years. I think this partly reflects an acknowledgement that it takes time for outsiders to build up the level of knowledge and insight that thinking and working politically calls for. It takes time to build up the networks of local stakeholders as well. And I think it's also partly a recognition that these processes of institutional and behavioural change that underpin some of the most complex and intractable development problems take time to solve. And the timeframes often can't be confined within the sort of typical 5-year program cycle very often. TWP-style programs need to find creative ways of accounting for their results and measuring their progress. The traditional M&E methods are largely designed to track progress in more linear, sort of pre-planned projects, which are premised on both the result and the pathway to it being more or less known from the outset. These kinds of methods are less suitable for programs where results emerge over time in the course of implementation and where there's a need to track changes in program strategy and action. Now, this is very much an emerging area of practice, and there's no kind of settled consensus on the best way of doing M&E in the context of thinking and working politically. the literature contains a number of interesting examples where log frames and other traditional sort of planning and evaluation frameworks have been adapted to service the needs of a more flexible approach. I think it's interesting that rather than sort of tearing up the M&E rulebook, as it were, a lot of these examples are using conventional log frames to pursue clear outcomes, but leaving the inputs and outputs sufficiently open-ended to allow for adaptation and course correction as they go along. I suspect that might have more to do with, at least as far as DFID goes, the way in which programs are evaluated at the midterm and the annual review process, rather than any kind of inherent lack of creativity amongst officials. And finally, an important precondition for all of these approaches is a supportive political and bureaucratic environment. To think and to work politically, staff need to have a sufficient amount of room to innovate, to experiment, to seize opportunities as they present themselves. Sometimes when you look at these programs, it manifests itself in the implementing teams working at arm's length from the donor, but that obviously implies a high level of trust between the donor and the implementing organisation. And I think what underlies a lot of this, a lot of the time, is a supportive head of office or country director who's very much on board with the approach that's being taken. So those are some of the success ingredients. But what some of you may be wondering is what does success mean in this context? And how clear is the connection between these ingredients and successful program outcomes? To try to answer some of these questions, we took a close look at the research methods that have been used in studying these kinds of approaches. I should caveat these next comments by saying that thinking and working politically is still very much an emerging field. A lot of research effort to date has gone into establishing what thinking and working politically means, and developing appropriate kinds of analytical tools to implement and to study it. So it's understandable that there are some limitations in the scope and the methods that have been used to document and study these programs. That said, there are some pretty noticeable limitations that we found, and these limit the overall strength of the evidence base. A lot of these, in fact, most of these case studies are written up as single reports rather than being situated in a comparative report that looks at different approaches in different sectors and contexts and tries to draw out lessons in that way. They tend to only focus on successes rather than challenges and setbacks, and that raises a bit of a red flag. There's very little discussion of counterfactuals, and little effort is made to triangulate the findings that are put forward in these studies. The methods that are commonly used involve qualitative interviews and documentary analysis. And whilst these are really good at showing you the processes of thinking and working politically and what they look like on the ground, they're less robust as methods for establishing causal connections between those processes and program outcomes. And finally, you could say that the number of case studies that are published in well-regarded peer-reviewed journals could act as a bit of a proxy for a strong evidence base, but actually what you find is that is almost without exception, the case studies that we found that self-identify with thinking working politically label are in organisational working papers, in think pieces, other kinds of grey literature. A lot of the conversation is also unfolded on blogs and online commentary, which obviously has implications for the robustness of some of the arguments that are being put forward. I think that as the field has developed, and particularly in the last couple of years, authors are taking more care to explain their research methods and also to explore insights about thinking and working politically in a more comparative way. But I think there are there are further steps that are necessary if we want to build a more robust evidence base. The first is systematically comparing and contrasting a wider range of different programming approaches in a wider range of contexts in order to draw out some more robust lessons about what works and why, or what doesn't work and why. And ideally using a wider range of research methods to do that kind of work, so drawing on counterfactuals, doing more triangulation, undertaking longer range studies to see if the initial results of programs are sustained over time, and so on. But to do this kind of comparative work well, you need a baseline, right? You need to know where research efforts have been focused so far and where some of the gaps are. So that's what we tried to do next in the paper. We looked at how the evidence on thinking and working politically is currently clustered in regard to three levels: the political context, the sector, and the organisation. So starting with the wider political context that these programs are situated in, I think the main thing that we noticed is that there's a pretty significant gap in terms of thinking and working politically in fragile and conflict-affected states. This strikes us as a pretty glaring omission, given the increase of aid from major donors like DFID and the World Bank in these countries. And so we felt that should be a pretty important research priority going forward. Thanks. Yeah, so next, thinking about the sector where thinking and working politically programs have been situated. Hopefully you can all sort of make out the fine print there, but this gives you an indication on the X, the number of case studies, and on the Y, the various different sectors that have been looked at in the literature. I think the first thing to take away is there's obviously a real breadth of different sectors that have been looked at in this literature. That's encouraging in one sense. It suggests that thinking and working politically might offer a way of making progress on quite a diverse set of different issues. But you'll also notice there's quite a lack of depth. Really, governance is the only sector that has been the subject of sustained study. It's very hard to say anything with confidence about how you can think and work politically in response to the particular political characteristics of different sectors without having a deeper evidence base to draw on. One of the ways you might go about doing that, developing that evidence base, is undertaking a study, for example, that looks at a range of different politically informed programming approaches in a particular sector, and in that sense getting a clearer sense of what does or doesn't work. Until recently, in terms of some of the wider issue areas that thinking and working politically has been focused on, there's been quite a glaring omission in terms of gender. Very few of the case studies that we looked at are looking at programs that are directly focused on gender-related objectives. And it's been noted by others that political economy analysis, particularly some of the earlier models, didn't really have very much to say about gender. Given the fact that gender is pretty clearly one of the most pervasive sources of power that structures people's lives, I think a very strong argument can be made that if you are not considering the gender implications of a particular issue area or sector, you're failing to be politically smart. Happily, some new research streams are underway or have been published very recently that are looking to address this gap. And in particular, the Developmental Leadership Programme has recently put out a series of reports and case studies that are looking at how linking together forms of gender analysis with thinking and working politically offers a way of unlocking progress in certain country contexts. And I would really encourage anyone who's interested in that aspect of the debate to go away and have a look. Unfortunately, they were published more or less at the same time as we were finalising our paper, so we weren't able to reflect on those findings in our report. Moving on to think about the organisations that are commonly the subject of a TWP literature. Again, number of case studies on the X and the range of organisations on the Y. Hopefully, again, you can read the fine print, but it shows here that the literature has been very heavily focused on the role of bilateral and multilateral donors. And within that, there's a very heavy focus on DFID, DFAT, and the World Bank. This is not necessarily surprising, given that these are the organisations that are funding a lot of the research on thinking and working politically. But it seems pretty clear that strengthening the evidence base requires researchers to look at a broader range of organisations and agents that are involved in this kind of programming. In particular, something that I think has been overlooked in the literature or not focused on very much is the kinds of pressures and constraints that this sort of programming puts on implementing organisations. And that's something that I'll come back to towards the end of my discussion. This emphasis on donor-led reform processes in the literature also means that the literature as it stands doesn't have a lot to say about how you think and work politically on development challenges through non-aid channels, things like international policy processes. I think that developing the evidence base along some of the lines that I've pointed to is a really important next step for the research agenda. But I think it's also important that researchers develop a better understanding of some of the political and bureaucratic factors that often make it quite hard for donors to work in more political ways. As I sort of alluded to at the outset, despite a lot of donors adopting the language of politics and investing in better tools and frameworks for political analysis, actually changing a practice to make it more politically responsive has proven difficult. Why is that? Partly, I think it's to do with some of the wider incentives in the overall development landscape. As we all know, in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crash, Western donors have been put under massive pressure to demonstrate results and value for money to sceptical parliaments and publics, particularly in light of overall reductions in public spending. The issue from a TWP perspective is that a lot of the managing and reporting systems that donors have created to try to demonstrate value for money and to demonstrate the results of their programs are quite hard to reconcile with these more politically informed and adaptive ways of working. That's because they tend to rely on the quite precise identification of targets. The results agenda is part of a broader aversion to risk on the part of donors. I think for a lot of senior donor officials in particular, the idea that the solutions to problems have to be hammered out through a process of trial and error, and that learning involves failure, can be quite an unnerving prospect. I think the onus is on us as researchers who are interested in these ideas to make a stronger case that thinking and working politically is lower risk than the blueprint type approach. But that obviously brings us back to the need for a stronger evidence base. Another commonly discussed organizational challenge for this more politically informed approach stems from the imperative in donors to allocate and disperse funds in a predictable way. In a lot of the cases of thinking and working politically, the initiatives that donors are supporting involve a significant investment of time and effort, but relatively low spend. Particularly the sort of the more convening work, that is administratively quite burdensome, but it actually doesn't spend a huge amount of the country office's budget. That kind of programming is quite difficult to reconcile with some of the overarching incentives that agencies face to spend large amounts of money with low administrative outlay. Finally, there are some outstanding issues around the kinds of working relationships that donors need to establish with implementing partners in order to properly incentivize and reward them for adopting more political and adaptive approaches. Anecdotally, I think you hear from quite a lot of providers that the pressures of competitive funding bids often incentivize them to put forward quite linear project plans over the more kind of experimental, risky, adaptive approach. So in summary, as I said at the outset, it does feel like thinking and working politically has made a really significant contribution in shaping the terms of the debate. And it's really encouraging, I think, to see the level of interest that a lot of donors are showing in these ideas. But I would say on the basis of this report, we need a much stronger evidence base to support that enthusiasm and to provide a more solid foundation for future efforts along these sorts of lines. It's about developing a better understanding of how thinking and working politically works in different kinds of political and organizational and sectoral contexts, using more robust methods and a wider range of methods in order to do that, and also connecting that research agenda more closely to the operational realities for donors and implementers on the ground. Thanks very much to all of you for listening. Just to say again, what a pleasure it is to be back here. I'm very much looking forward to hearing your questions.